Black Dahlia is one of the most infamous unsolved murders in history. Almost a century ago, Elizabeth Short's dead body was found chopped into two complete halves and totally drained of blood. Her killer had enacted their darkest, most depraved desires onto this woman, including cutting a permanent smile into her face, and then they left the evidence on the roadside for everyone to see. So today we're going to discuss the details of the murder, and then we're going to analyse all of the suspects and the theories that still stand to this day, and hopefully by the end of this video you'll be able to make your own mind up on who you think killed the Black Dahlia. Quickly, before we get into the case, I just want to thank our sponsor for making this video possible, Casetify. It's the most wonderful time of the year. It is new iPhone season. I always get really excited every September to see the new iPhone and all the new features. And you know what else that means? New phone case season, which is arguably more exciting than the actual iPhone itself. If you're thinking about upgrading your phone soon like I am, then you also need to be thinking about how you're gonna protect your new baby. You can't spend all that much money on a phone and not protect it. You want to start looking for a super protective but also super cute case for your new phone, and you know what? Casetify has you covered. And I basically just want to show you a bunch of my favourite phone cases right now because I love Casetify phone cases. You guys know this, and I have been in a clear case era lately. Because I am such an iPhone stan, sometimes I like to see my phone through the case, especially if you're gonna get one of the cute colours. You don't want to spend all that money on a cute coloured phone just to cover it up with a case. And I think the clear ones are really, really good because you can get like completely clear or like slightly clear with a little bit of a customization on, or you can go for what's like half clear. It's got a pattern and it's clear. Or if you're as clumsy as I am, might I recommend Casetify's bounce cases? Trust me, these are some of the most protective phone cases on the damn planet, I'm sure of it. One of these cases is an essential for a night out. If you're a phone dropper or a phone thrower like myself. The bounce corners on these cases give it so much more protection. These are up to 21 feet drop protected. I always switch to one of these cases before going to like a festival or a party or even just a long day, because that is the only way that I can assure that my phone will be coming back in one piece along with me. And another tip for the clumsy girls, this is one of my new favourite Casetify products. The phone charms. I have had these for a while, but I didn't get into a routine of using it until this summer, and trust me, this is life-changing. They also have phone straps if you want to wear your phone like around your neck or something, but I really just like having mine on my wrist because you can be like type in and then just done. These are especially good if you're prone to leaving your phone in another room like I am. It's so handy to just have your phone as a little accessory. And I say this all the time, your phone and its case becomes an accessory. I mean, you've kind of always got it in your hand, pretty much. So it just becomes another part of your aesthetic, and I really like dressing up my phone. They have all sorts of cute straps, just like they have all sorts of prints and all sorts of customizations. Honestly, the possibilities are endless with Casetify, and I think you can find something that matches your aesthetic to a T. And Casetify are very kindly offering you guys 15% off your order when you go to casetify.com/Eleanor. The code will be automatically applied for you at checkout. So like I say, if you are thinking about upgrading your phone this September or anytime at all, then make sure you're protecting it and getting a really cute phone case at the same time. Thanks again to Casetify for sponsoring this video. Remember, it's casetify.com/Eleanor. One last thing before we get into the case, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is publicly available information that myself and my team have found online and compiled into this video. This video will cover especially sensitive topics, including but not limited to sexual assault, abuse, suicide, incest, abortion, and descriptions of very gory scenes and mutilation. If you feel that these topics might be triggering or too intense for you, then I would recommend that you click out of the video now. Hopefully I'll get to catch you some other time with a different video, but until then, look after yourself. And while we make every effort to fact check our sources and make sure that all of our information is correct, no action should be taken in reliance upon the information in this video. And I want to take this opportunity to remind you all that these are real people's lives that we're talking about, so please keep things kind and respectful in the comments section. All opinions stated in this video are mine and mine alone, and with that being said, let's get into the case. So today's case is a vintage Hollywood true crime story from the 1940s. Probably one of the most infamous true crime cases ever. I feel like everyone has heard about the Black Dahlia case. Hopefully this video can give you a little bit of information that you didn't know already. But the Black Dahlia was probably one of the first majorly talked about and majorly documented cases of unsolved murder and brutal mutilation. This was one of the first of its kind, and it's a fucking depraved one, so let's go. So for context, in the early 1900s, movie theatres and like cinema situations had just been invented, and they very quickly captured the nation, well, captured the whole entire world. And along with it, the concept of celebrity and fame also just snowballed to this insurmountable thing that we know now. Small-scale celebrities had been a thing for centuries before movie theatres. I mean, people had always loved playwrights and the actors that starred in those plays. But now that movies could be recorded and then distributed all over the world, it was just going worldwide. It was bigger than anyone had ever expected fame to be. Celebrities suddenly had like a bajillion times more reach than they ever had just acting on a stage. Now their names could be known worldwide. Movie theatres became such a pillar of people's social lives and the entertainment that they consumed, and everyone was falling for actors and actresses, you know, like Clark Gable, Gloria Swanson, Charlie Chaplin. Glitz, glamour and stardom was suddenly a huge thing, and it was very aspirational. Everyone wanted to be like the actors and actresses that they saw on screen. So many young people would grow up going to the movie theatre and seeing all of these movies and wanting to be just like them and turning to their parents and saying, "Mum, I want to be on the big screen one day." So by the 1940s and 50s, when these children were grown-ups, they were like in their early 20s, they all started flocking to Los Angeles, to Hollywood, to try to make it as an actor. But when they got there, of course, they were expecting to find this world of glitz and glamour and everyone's famous and everyone's beautiful and everything's happy. But it wasn't that fairy tale that they were expecting it to be. 1940s America was quite a sad place, honestly. I mean, it was post-war, post-Great Depression. It was very poor. Everyone was very depressed. And I guess that was kind of the vibe for a lot of the world at that point in time, post-war. But Hollywood had made itself seem so great from the outside. And I mean, it was. The film industry really, really was. But when people would get into Los Angeles expecting to see that, they were met with just depression. At this point in time, the whole world pretty much had this underlying feeling of darkness and sadness. And that was really being reflected in the movies that were being made at the time. Film noir became a really, really big genre, especially in the beginning of cinema. And one of the biggest characteristics of film noir is depressing storylines to a degree, whether it's death. A lot of them are crime dramas, even if it's not as brutal as death. Things like affairs, cheating, you know, anything that's like a little bit dark, a little bit, you know, things that weren't really covered in movies up until this point were starting to be covered. And I find it really interesting how trends reflect kind of the general feeling of the world at the time. It's like during the pandemic, crime dramas and true crime became so big because everyone was just feeling kind of down, and you don't really want to watch something super happy when you're feeling quite down. You want something that's reflecting. And that was what was happening at the time. People were just lapping up film noir movies. So in 1947, the year that this case took place, we have a very complex vibe in Los Angeles. It's a mix of glamour and sophistication and beauty, and also desperation and danger. And the Black Dahlia case represents this whole feeling scarily well. She was a beautiful young woman that chased her dreams to Hollywood, hoping to make it as an actress, but instead was brutally murdered and mutilated for no apparent reason. On January 15th, 1947, a woman named Betty was out running some errands with her 3-year-old daughter. They had left the house pretty early that morning so that they could get everything done and sorted before dinner. As they were walking through a rather undeveloped neighborhood, because there were quite a lot of these at this point in time, once the war hit, they kind of just halted a lot of building and a lot of development in the city. So there were a lot of empty lots around. And on this particular day, as they were running their errands, they walked past an empty lot. And Betty noticed what she thought to be a mangled shop mannequin just laying in the grass. It looked like it had been separated into 2 separate halves. So the torso was completely separate from the legs in the bottom half. But as Betty was walking closer and closer towards this shop mannequin, she realized just how realistic it was. The features were too detailed. The skin was too skin-like. And that was when she realized that this wasn't a mannequin, it was a dead body. A dead body that was cut in 2, right down the middle. Betty was absolutely horrified making this realization. And the next thought that popped into her head was her daughter. She is with her 3-year-old daughter, and this is a potentially traumatizing sight that could stick with her daughter for life. She knew that she couldn't let her daughter see that, and she couldn't let anyone else see that. So she grabbed her daughter and rushed to one of the nearest houses to borrow their phone and call the police to report what she had just found. When they arrived, police were completely taken aback by how gruesome this scene was. A lot of them had never seen anything like this in their whole careers. Imagine, they've just clocked into work, it's a Wednesday morning, they're expecting just another day, and then they got called to one of the most horrifying crime scenes in history. The body of a young woman lay in the grass, completely naked. She was lying face up, and her body was completely cut into 2 halves right at the base of her torso. And this cut was done disturbingly well. This is one of the first things police noticed, was that it wasn't jagged, it wasn't messy, it was done so clean and with a lot of precision. It wasn't a rushed, butchered job by someone that had just tried to last minute hack up their murder victim. It was scary how much thought had been put into how her body was bisected. It must have been someone that was quite clued up on human anatomy, perhaps a surgeon, someone with a medical degree. And it also seemed as though her killer had intentionally posed the 2 parts of her body. So her eyes were wide open for a start, her legs were stretched out and spread apart, her arms were bent up by her head. There was about a foot gap between the 2 parts of her body, which I think was intentional, to almost put her together, but not quite. It's kind of like he's drawing attention to what he's done. I'm saying he because this murderer is generally believed to have been a man. I could be wrong. I just think it was very intentional to almost put her together, to make her almost look like herself. It's very much drawing attention to the fact that she is sawn in half and she is not still a full intact body. But despite the complete bisection of her body, her internal organs seemed untouched. I mean, if anything, her intestines that were coming out of the bottom of her torso had been tucked underneath her body when she'd been positioned and posed, which again I think is intentional. He's kind of clearing up how she's going to be found. Whoever had done this to her had also gone to great lengths to mutilate her, both before and after her death. Most notably, one thing that a lot of people talk about when they talk about the Black Dahlia are the lacerations to her face. There were 2 great big slashes, about 3 inches long, going from the corners of her mouth pretty much all the way up to her ears. her killer had given her a permanent Joker smile. This kind of wound goes by a lot of different names. I've heard it called a Glasgow smile, a Chelsea smile, a Cheshire grin, but no matter what you call it, this is one of the most disturbing ways to torture someone. And one of the worst parts of all of this is they believe that these incisions were done while she was still alive. There was slight bruising around the edges of the wounds, which means that the blood was trying to clot there. It was trying to fix itself. Of course, we won't be showing any pictures of the actual dead body in this video, and I do just want to give you a little bit of a warning because I know a lot of you like to research these cases alongside my videos, but the photos of her body are just on Google, and they're very disturbing. So I would be careful if you're gonna Google alongside. But we will pop in like a recreation image, specifically of that queen from season 1 of American Horror Story that played the Black Dahlia. This is essentially what her wounds looked like. So it's believed that the Glasgow smile was done to her while she was still alive, although it's believed that a lot of the mutilation that I'm now gonna describe for you was done post-murder. There were a lot of slash wounds all over her body in a kind of crosshatch pattern, so they'd gone one way and then gone the other. These were on her breasts, on her stomach, on her thighs, pretty much everywhere. And what's even more gory is that some of the chunks of skin between the crosses had been cut out. There were some sources that mentioned a potential rose tattoo that this victim might have had on her thigh that had been completely cut away. Now, I couldn't quite consolidate that. It was mentioned in a few sources, but not all. And this is a very old case, so sometimes rumours do get circulated. I even saw some sources say that the chunk of skin with the tattoo on was then shoved inside of her, which also leads me to think that maybe that is just a sensationalized part of this story, because I couldn't find any more on that. I'm inclined to believe that that wasn't true, but just in case you've heard of that part of the Black Dahlia case, I did want to mention it because, you know, some people do think that. But in spite of how butchered this poor woman's body was, there was not a single drop of blood at the whole crime scene. Not one. Her body seemed to have been intentionally drained of all of the blood left inside of her. And then after that, her body had been scrubbed, like washed down, so that there was no blood left on her, wet or dry. In fact, her body had been scrubbed that hard that they found some brush bristles still stuck inside parts of her wounds. And because of this lack of blood in the body, of course, all the colour was completely drained out of her. And that's one of the reasons why Betty thought that what she was seeing was a shop mannequin. I actually have a quote from her that says, "It was so white, it didn't look like anything more than perhaps an artificial model. It was so white, and it was separated in the middle." Now, because this victim's body had been completely drained of blood, but there wasn't a single drop at the scene, that must mean that this wasn't the murder site. She had been killed somewhere else, and then her body had been transported here after all of this mutilation and blood draining and everything had happened, and then her killer posed her here. Everything was very intentional with this murder and the mutilation and the whole aftermath, the way that her body was posed, even down to where her killer chose to leave her. She was just on an empty lot, laying in the grass. The first person to walk past that empty lot was going to find her that morning. Her killer wanted her to be found. They put her there so that someone would discover her. In a lot of ways, the Black Dahlia's killer had put tremendous thought into this killing, and you can see it in every single aspect. The victim's cause of death was actually a cerebral hemorrhage, a bleed on the brain, and it was very evident that she had been beaten severely before she was killed. She had bruising all over her head. A lot of people believe that the victim was extensively tortured before she was actually killed. Of course, she had all these beatings to her head, which means she was alive throughout a lot of the beatings and the mouth incisions. There were marks on her body that showed that she'd been tied up, she'd been restrained for quite some time. They were on her wrists, on her ankles, on her neck. Although something interesting to come out of her autopsy was that there was no internal strangulation. So it was just kind of tight ties, tight restraints. She wasn't actively being strangled. Her autopsy also showed that there was no evidence of sexual assault. But, I mean, take that with a pinch of salt. This was the 1940s, and I'm sure their tests back then were not that thorough. They might have just tested for semen inside of her, but we know that that doesn't determine sexual assault or not. And regardless of whether there was actually, you know, any kind of penetration, this case is still very much believed to have had some sort of sexual motive to it. The killer may have got some sexual gratification in another way that didn't involve, you know, penetrating the victim. Of course, due to the level of disfigurement from all of the different mutilations and the beatings, police knew it was going to be hard for them to identify this victim just from how she looks. They knew they were probably going to have to do it in a more scientific way. So the young woman's fingerprints were sent off to the FBI to be tested against their database, and luckily, as weird as this woman had been arrested once before in her life, and so she had to give over fingerprints which were in the FBI database, so thank God they could identify her. The Black Dahlia was identified as 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, born July 29th, 1924. She was originally from Boston, Massachusetts, and she'd lived there pretty much her whole life, but she had very recently moved out to LA in hopes of chasing her dreams of becoming an actress. The reason she was in the police database, by the way, I feel the need to clear this up. She was actually arrested for underage drinking, and so the police had taken all their fingerprints just as a precaution, I guess. So luckily, her fingerprints were in the system, but she was never in much major trouble while she was alive. Her mother described Elizabeth as a movie-struck girl. She really, really dreamed of becoming famous one day, and her mom thought that she could do it. I mean, Elizabeth was very charming. She was very, very beautiful. That was one thing that Elizabeth was very known for in her lifetime, was being an absolute knockout. She was such a hit with the men. A lot of men would just stand there and just watch her walk by in the street, which I know is a bit gross, but back then it was probably considered a bit less gross and a bit more flattering. Elizabeth had quite a rough childhood, of course, due to the war and the Great Depression and everything. Everyone kind of had a rough childhood around that time. Finances weren't great. And in fact, Elizabeth's family struggled so much financially. I believe her father was a stockbroker, and so when the stock market crashed and everything, it definitely affected them more than it affected the average family. And around this time, Elizabeth's father was believed to have taken his own life due to all the financial stress and not wanting to let his family down. His car was found parked near a bridge, and so it was assumed that he had jumped off and died. But it was later discovered that he had faked his own death. Faked his own death even from his family. He didn't tell anyone about this plan, and he'd just run off somewhere and started a whole new life. When his career crashed and he had no money left, he abandoned his wife and their 5 children and just went off to try and make it somewhere else. His family were left absolutely devastated, of course. They were grieving, they were heartbroken, left trying to pick up the pieces without him and without his money as well. It feels bad to even bring up the topic of money when they believed that he died, but now that we know he wasn't dead and he had just faked his death this whole time, how selfish is that? For you to be the sole earner of your family, and just because finances are getting a bit rough, you fake your death and leave your wife to try to raise 5 children, to try to put food on the table for 5 children plus herself. Like, I think it's okay to point out how selfish that is, because all these years later, he ended up just sending Elizabeth's mother a letter saying, "Hi, it's me, and I'm ready to come home now." He kind of explained everything. And her mum reads this letter and she's like, "I don't want you back." She'd made it work on her own, unbelievably as well. 5 children, and she somehow managed to raise them all well, get them a new apartment. I mean, it was a very small one. She managed to get a job as a bookshop clerk. And she did it. She managed to be a single mother to 5 daughters. So by the time she gets this letter, she's like, I don't need that. I don't need a lying husband anymore. So I imagine childhood was very rocky for Elizabeth. It can't have been easy. She was dealing with so many different issues, whether it was financial issues, grieving her father that they thought committed suicide, having to, completely rebuild their life and get a new house and everything. All of that while she's still developing. But as a teenager, Elizabeth Shaw and her friends really got into the cinema. They were obsessed with movies and actors and actresses. They would go to the cinema genuinely nearly every time they hung out. And when she got a bit older and it came time for her to get her first job, Elizabeth went and got a job at the cinema. She wanted to be as close as she could to movies. This was like her biggest interest, her biggest passion in life. She loved to talk about movies with anyone that would listen. And you know where you're gonna find that? In the damn cinema. When she was in her late teens, early 20s, Elizabeth met a man. He was a military man and he fell head over heels for Elizabeth. To be fair, men were always kind of falling for her, but she wasn't gonna take just anyone. She was holding out for the perfect man and she thought she had found him. But this relationship would end in complete tragedy. Because he was a military man, he was away fighting in the war for most of their relationship. So a lot of it was done through like letters back and forth to each other, love letters. And in one of them, he even asked for her hand in marriage and promised that he would marry her as soon as he got back from war. But just 1 week before the war was declared over, her fiancé got into a devastating plane crash and everyone involved died. They were literally 1 week away from being able to start their life together, from being reunited, from getting married and, you know, potentially having kids and living the rest of their lives together. But all of that was taken just 1 week before the war was over. Elizabeth was, of course, heartbroken. But her love of cinema helped to pull her through. Her friends would take her to watch movies and, you know, that was like her happy place. And naturally, because movies did bring her so much happiness, Elizabeth decided that she wanted that life for herself. She wanted to be in the movies, not just watching them. And so with that, she moved out to Los Angeles, hoping that she could make it as a leading lady in the pictures. Although that wasn't going as well as she had hoped. When she arrived in Los Angeles, she got herself a job as a waitress just to make ends meet, you know, in between acting jobs or between auditions. But these acting jobs weren't coming in. It was a tricky time to be an actor. Well, is there ever an easy time to be an actor? I guess it's always been a very saturated and competitive market, but especially then because these were the first generations of kids that had grown up on movies. There was an overwhelming amount of kids that had grown up wanting to be an actor or an actress, and so they were all flocking to LA, to Hollywood, all at the same time as Elizabeth. And they were all going for the same parts. She was competing against thousands of other young, beautiful, talented, charming women that wanted the exact same roles as her. It was very hard. At the time of her death, Elizabeth was renting a bedroom in an apartment that was just behind one of her favourite nightclubs on Hollywood Boulevard, and she was just making ends meet as a waitress. It was hard to find any acting credits to Elizabeth's name. In fact, a lot of people believe there aren't any. She never actually managed to successfully get a role in a movie before she passed away. And that's one thing that people sensationalize about the Black Dahlia case so much, is that this was a young, hopeful starlet who just wanted to be a famous actress, but she was brutally murdered before she could ever make it. But then in death, she becomes this infamous murder victim, the Black Dahlia. People think, oh, she never achieved the fame in her lifetime, but in her death, she is very famous. They say that she achieved her dreams in some kind of warped way, but sadly she just wasn't around anymore to see how famous she had become. And I don't love that way of looking at this case. I mean, I get what people mean by it, but it also just feels a bit icky. Like, Elizabeth never dreamed of becoming a famous murder victim. No one ever dreams of that. This isn't achieving anyone's dreams. She wanted to be an actress. She wanted to be watched on the movie screen, not talked about in the papers and in documentaries. But regardless, the media really did make Elizabeth Shaw famous in death. They came up with the nickname the Black Dahlia for her very early on, and it's not 100% confirmed why or how she got this name. Some people think this was already her nickname when she was alive. People used to call her the Black Dahlia. Although my theory, the closest theory that I've found, is that this was a nickname given by the media. Back then, the media used to nickname pretty much every murder victim that was found, like, out in public, and it was, like, big national news, they would all have some sort of nickname. And I think the way that they got this one, there was a movie out at the time called The Blue Dahlia, and of course Elizabeth really wanted to be an actress, and she had this very striking dyed jet black hair. That was one of her most noticeable features, was her curly black locks. And so I think they just kind of took the name of this movie, The Blue Dahlia. She wanted to be in movies, she had this very characteristic black hair, the Black Dahlia. Her case was all that anyone could talk about for weeks and weeks and weeks, and everyone was speculating about, like, the details of her life and of her death, and rumours started to just take over and get spread like wildfire. And so for that reason, there are actually a lot of misconceptions when it comes to the Black Dahlia case. For example, the whole actress thing, she's always referred to as an actress or a starlet and things like that, which I also kind of want to be able to call her, because we know that that was her dream. She was an aspiring actress, an aspiring starlet, but she never actually got those acting jobs. I guess that's more of a harmless rumour, but the rumours do get a lot more disrespectful. A lot of people think that Elizabeth was a prostitute, or she was involved in porn movies, and then this is how she got herself into that situation. All very victim-blamey things. And they're not even true. She wasn't a prostitute. She was never in porn movies. Nothing like that. In fact, her friends said that she was a little bit of a prude. Like, she wouldn't let men go all the way with her very often. She was very picky about who she gave her time and her energy to. So none of that is true. There were some rumours that maybe she was a lesbian and she hung out in these lesbian circles, and then it was a lesbian that did that to her. I don't know. There were even reports that she was friends with Marilyn Monroe, and Marilyn Monroe was in these lesbian circles, and maybe they were a couple, and, you know, shit was really, really getting out of hand. And none of the rumours are true. I think a lot of it is because the media saw Elizabeth as this young starlet that was cut down in her prime before she could even make it. They want to sensationalise and scandalise her life just like they have with her death. Essentially, they wanted to make it a real-life film noir. They were acting as if this woman wasn't a real woman with a real life and a real past. They were making up a character as to who the Black Dahlia could be and how she could have gotten herself killed like this. Journalists were very, very hungry for a new spin on the Black Dahlia case back then, so I think that's where a lot of these rumours came from. They were literally just pulled out of their ass, really. And this came to a head one day when a journalist found Elizabeth Short's mother's phone number. No one had found her family's contact details yet, not even the police. Well, actually, around this time in, like, the 1940s, early 1900s, the police and the media and, like, journalists and reporters would work alongside each other. They would kind of share the information that they had back and forth. It was a mutually beneficial relationship because they were both looking into this case from two different kind of lenses. And so they would often share a lot of the information that they got. However, it was actually a journalist, a reporter, that first found Elizabeth's mother's phone number. That was the first time they would actually be able to contact her family. Right now, her family out in Massachusetts didn't know that she'd been murdered. So a journalist finds this phone number, and instead of handing it over to the police and letting them call her family and break the news in a professional, formal way, the journalist decided to call up her mother first, before anyone else could. But instead of using the number to call up and inform her mother, they actually used it for personal gain, to be able to get details for an article. They called up her mother and said that they were the hosts of a beauty contest out in LA, and her daughter, Elizabeth Short, had just won, and they were wanting to write a celebratory article about their winner. And so they were asking her all these different questions and asking for stories about her daughter, just getting details. And of course, Elizabeth's mother was very proud hearing that her daughter had won a beauty contest out in LA. To her, that is very comforting to know that her daughter is, you know, achieving the kind of things that she wants to. I'm guessing beauty contest circles will overlap with actress circles. So she was very proud. She was freely giving over all this information to the journalist on the phone. And then after about 10-15 minutes of this, the journalist drops the act and lets her know that Elizabeth hadn't won a beauty contest. She had died. She had been murdered, mutilated, drained of blood. And this is how her mother found out, which is just one of the most heinous things I think I've ever heard in a true crime case. For that journalist to actively try to lead her mother into, you know, this positive thought that her daughter was achieving things, and they were to actively lie to a victim's mother just makes me so angry. And then to just drop it on her like that, to switch and then drop it on her like that. It's bad enough to have lied to her for ages, but I'm sure there was a softer way to I don't know. That makes me so sad though. I just want to skip ahead slightly. We'll go back to the police investigation in a second, but I wanted to let you know kind of what happened to Elizabeth Short's body after this, after the police investigation. It was, of course, released to her family for them to be able to give her a funeral and lay her to rest. I mean, they had to keep the body for a long time because that was kind of the only evidence that they had. But eventually, when it was released to the family, it was embalmed and essentially kind of put back together and embalmed so that she could be buried in all one piece. Back to the police investigation. The search for the Black Dahlia killer was going very, very slowly. They were getting a lot of leads in because this was a very quickly famous case. Everyone was talking about the Black Dahlia murder within a day of it going out in the news. And so they were getting a lot of leads. But that's the thing about such a famous case that brings in a lot of leads. Most of them are gonna be useless. That was until January 21st, 6 days after Elizabeth Short's body was found. The LA Herald-Examiner newspaper received a call from someone claiming to be the Black Dahlia killer. It was a man with a soft voice. He spoke with a lot of composure and confidence, and even a bit of cockiness. Like there was an element of performance to his voice and the way that he said things. He was very proud of what he'd done to the Black Dahlia, and he was reveling in the fact that he was eluding police for so long. He started by congratulating the newspaper on their reporting of the case so far, but then he started teasing them, saying, well, I bet you're running out of information around this point. And so he told them he had something to offer them as the Black Dahlia's killer. He said he had some souvenirs of Beth Short. And he even called her Beth, which was quite shocking because in the media she was only ever called Elizabeth, full name, and it was her friends and family that called her Beth or Bet or Betty. No, like, it was weird that someone claiming to be her killer was using her nickname, her informal name. After informing the journalist that he would be mailing these souvenirs of Beth Short to the newspaper's office, the caller then abruptly put the phone down. And 3 days later, it seemed he made good on his promise when a letter was stopped by the Postal Service that was addressed to the Los Angeles Examiner and other Los Angeles papers. Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow. But this message wasn't handwritten onto the letter. It was actually done like some kind of old school detective show ransom note where they had cut out clippings from magazines, specifically from articles about the Black Dahlia murder, and he had cut together all these words and pasted them so that his handwriting obviously couldn't be studied and analysed and matched up. Inside the envelope were a bunch of Elizabeth Short's things. Actual belongings of hers, like her birth certificate, her ID card, a bunch of photographs that she carried around of her and friends and her ex-fiancé who sadly passed away. And in that envelope there was also an address book, but it didn't seem to be Elizabeth's address book. It had someone else's name embossed on the front. Although everything else in that package was without a doubt hers. It was her birth certificate, her ID, and the killer claimed that these were all things that he had found in her handbag on the day that she disappeared. At first, the police and the paper kind of thought that this phone call was just going to be a hoax. It was just going to be someone claiming to be the killer, claiming they had evidence, and they were never going to see a package of it. But now they had that proof. They knew that this was to be taken seriously. They genuinely were communicating with the Black Dahlia killer. So this package was examined and analysed. It smelled very, very strongly of gasoline, and when all of the different items were tested, it was found that they had been rubbed with gasoline in order to get rid of any fingerprints on them. There wasn't a single fingerprint on anything, not Elizabeth's, not anyone else's. It's scary how much the Black Dahlia killer knows about everything, about how to dissect a body, about how to avoid getting fingerprints on evidence. Like, he seems to know so much, and he's always one step ahead of the police. The package itself and all of these belongings didn't really give them many leads to go off. It was just proof that they had communicated with the actual murderer. I guess the only thing that they were really looking at was the address book that obviously wasn't hers, but it was on her person when she died, apparently. This address book, like I said, had another person's name embossed on the front, Mark Hansen. Not even close to Elizabeth Smart. And it had a few pages ripped out of it as well, which they thought could be important. They managed to track down this Mark Hansen, and they discovered that he was friends with Elizabeth Short. I think he was a bit more than friends with her. I think he was quite a seedy character, honestly. He strikes me as kind of not exactly a pimp, but definitely a womanizer that would offer women in need a place to stay with him. He was quite a wealthy man, and he wanted women's company, and he knew that a lot of these women needed a place to stay, and they wanted to go out for meals and, you know, all this kind of stuff. And I believe Elizabeth Short was one of those women. She came to LA with not a lot of money, and these are the kind of women that Mark Hansen would target. He would identify how they were vulnerable, and then he would offer them the things that they needed. So from time to time, Elizabeth had stayed with him at his house. He said that Elizabeth was actually using his address book at the time as her own, because it had a lot of their like mutual friends' numbers in it and stuff. So he'd just given her it, and you know, this is the first thing he'd heard of it since she disappeared. 2 days after receiving that package from the killer, the newspaper office received another letter, although this time it was handwritten. The note said, "Here it is, turning in on Wednesday, January 29th, 10 a.m. Had my phone at police." And it was signed Black Dahlia Avenger. The letter even included a specific location that the police believed this person would be going to at 10 a.m. on January 29th to turn themselves in. So just before that time, police kind of surrounded it and hid out a little bit, but no one ever turned up. Nothing ever happened. Another note arrived at the offices shortly after the last one saying, "Have changed my mind. You would not give me a square deal. Dahlia killing was justified." And this third letter was back to magazine cutouts now. And a lot of people have debated whether these last two letters are from the same person, if they were genuinely having a back and forth, or if the Black Dahlia killer had sent that one letter with the items and then other people were just kind of doing copycat things and trying to lead the police along. You know what the general public can be like when a case is very infamous. A lot of people want to get involved, even if they're lying. Regardless of whether the last two were confirmed, a lot of people think they are real. I will just say that. Like, they are believed to be a part of the Black Dahlia case. It's just me personally that's kind of been like, are we sure? But even if those last two weren't from the actual killer, that first phone call and the letter certainly was. And to me, it is terrifying that this killer that is managing to get away with it, as of currently, he is actively toying with the police, messing with them, leading them on a little bit. He's kind of drip feeding them the evidence and being like, okay, I can see that you're not solving this case very well. Here, have some of the evidence. It's very cocky. He's very aware that he is always one step ahead of the police. It is scary how well he could wrap everyone, including the police, around his finger. Police themselves were damn scared about this case. Like, they felt like no matter what they did, it wasn't happening quick enough. They weren't getting anywhere with anything. They had over 750 detectives on this case that had come in from all over America to try to put their heads together and solve this. But it still wasn't enough. Or at least it wasn't working quickly enough. They had upwards of 50 false confessions. So many people, that is so many people that want to confess to a murder that they haven't even done. That kind of psychology confuses me so much. You would be one of the most hated people in the whole entire world. Why do you want to be like, oh yeah, that was me? And it wasn't. Of course, police took a lot of these false confessions quite seriously, especially at first. You have to look into everything. You have to give everything time. But it turned out to just be a lot of attention seekers that were just kind of wasting time. So, as I said in the beginning, and as I'm sure a lot of you already knew, the Black Dahlia murder is still unsolved to this day. The police never actually managed to pin this murder on one person and get them charged. We still don't know for sure who killed Elizabeth Short, but there are a lot of suspects. You know, there are a lot of theories that the rest of this video will be focusing on. A lot of people think that Elizabeth Short could have been a victim of a serial killer, or they were called chain killers at the time. The term serial killer hadn't even been invented back then. We'll get into this a little bit later because I think these serial killer theories are not so promising. I think the individual suspect theories in this case are a lot more, I don't know. I think you'll gel with those ones a lot more, but I will mention the serial killer theories at the end because they are interesting and they are worth thinking about. Also, based on the evidence that we do have in this case, police believe that Elizabeth knew her killer and the killer knew her beforehand. She wasn't just a random victim of a serial killer. The fact that pages were torn out of that address book is the main thing that makes me think her killer must have known her enough to be in that address book, maybe. Maybe they were getting rid of their own details so that they wouldn't be connected. So there's 3 main named suspects in the Black Dahlia killing. The first of which was a man that she was seeing at the time in the run-up to her death. Robert Manley was a former army man that had actually had to drop out of the army for mental health reasons. He was nicknamed Red by his friends and family because he had bright ginger hair, so I'm going to be calling him Red in this video. He'd met Elizabeth about a month before her murder. He had been driving his car past a bus stop and noticed her standing there waiting for the bus, and he thought she was just breathtaking. So he pulled his car over and tried to chat to her, but apparently she didn't really want anything to do with him. She didn't talk to men like this very often. She was quite to herself, and so he was trying to get her attention, trying to talk to her, and she wasn't really talking, and he asked her if she needed a lift home, and she did. So she got in the car with him. Once they were in the car, they were driving, they were chatting, and they got on really well. And Red ended up asking Elizabeth on another date. And then for the next month, the two of them met up every now and again to go out for dinner or for a drink. And yeah, they did get on pretty well. But this was still very new. It was very early on. They'd only known each other for about a month, so they weren't serious. The last time that Elizabeth and Red went on a date was January 8th, which is the day before Elizabeth went missing, the day before she's believed to have been murdered. So they think she was murdered on January 9th, but her body wasn't actually found until the 15th, which is why a lot of people cling to this theory, because she went on a date with Red the night before. I believe he lived in San Diego, which is about 2 hours away from LA, so he'd come to pick her up, he'd brought her there, and they had a really nice date, but then she missed the last bus home. So that night, she stayed with Red in a hotel in San Diego, and the next morning, he drove her back to LA, and she was seen at her hotel. She stayed at the Biltmore Hotel sometimes in LA, and she was seen there on the morning of January 9th, and that is the last time Elizabeth Short was seen alive. That day, she disappeared, and then her body turned up 6 days later, completely mutilated. Some people think that during that 5-6 days between her going missing and her turning up dead, some people think that she was alive for a lot of that and that she was just being held somewhere and tortured by some madman. Although some people do think that she was killed the day that she went missing or very shortly after, and her body was just being messed with by her killer for a long time. And I think the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle of that. The killer would have needed a long time to, do everything that they did to her, bisect her completely, drain her of blood. But we also know from her autopsy that the cuts on her mouth were likely done while she was still alive because there was bruising. So we know that she was tortured while she was alive, but the killer would have also needed a decent amount of aftermath to be able to do that to her body. So the reason that people think it could have been Red is because, well, obviously he was the last person to see her alive, and they were very new to each other's lives. They'd only known each other a month, and the night before was the first time they'd spent the night together. So who knows what happened in that hotel room? Who knows if things ended well or sourly. Red was called into the police station at the time. Police were obviously onto him straight away, knowing that he'd been seeing her recently, but from the very beginning, he protested his innocence. He agreed to take 2 polygraph tests, lie detector tests, and he passed both of them. But as we know now, polygraph tests are a load of shit. They are not reliable, they're not very accurate. They don't really mean much at all. But back then, in the 1940s, that will have been a big deal, that he was very confident and willing to take 2 polygraphs and then pass them. To them, that would have pretty much ruled him out completely. Although these days, that won't mean diddly squat. They could definitely still be the killer. Police never really had any other evidence against Red. It was just circumstantial that, like, oh, suddenly you meet this woman and then a month later she turns up murdered. Like, that was just kind of the connection there. But there is one more interesting detail that came out years and years, actually decades, after the Black Dahlia murder, and that was that Red passed away 39 years to the day that he last saw Elizabeth Short. And he died from accidentally falling off the top of his apartment building. Some people think maybe that wasn't an accident. Maybe he took his own life on the anniversary of the day that he murdered the Black Dahlia 39 years prior. I mean, we don't know. There was no note left or anything. It was thought to be an accidental falling. So, maybe it was, and maybe it's just a coincidence with the timing. The second suspect I want to talk about is actually kind of 2 suspects in one. Okay, so it starts with a bellboy at a hotel named Leslie Dillon, and Leslie was questioned and suspected by police in the beginning, but nothing ever really came of it. But then in 2017, so pretty recently, an author named Pugh Eatwell published a book claiming to have solved the Black Dahlia murder, and she thinks it was Leslie Dillon. Her theory goes that Leslie Dillon did kill the Black Dahlia, but he was actually acting as a hitman on behalf of someone else. And if you remember the address book that Elizabeth Short was carrying on her when she died, it had the name Mark Hansen embossed on the front. Mark Hansen was a very wealthy man, and he was close friends with Leslie Dillon. I think I mentioned this earlier, but Mark Hansen was a very wealthy socialite in LA. I think he owned like nightclubs and stuff, so he was very well connected. He knew people that knew people, He was also kind of suspected by the police. I think the police were kind of onto this whole theory that maybe he was the orchestrator of the death and Leslie was the one that carried it out. Police started looking into them, but they very quickly let them go and just forgot all about it. A lot of people speculate that maybe Mark Hansen paid off the LAPD to forget about them, to look somewhere else, which wasn't very uncommon, especially for the LAPD. Police in general were very easy to bribe back then, but especially the LAPD. There are quite a few parts of this case that are very bundled up in potential police corruption. You'll see it more as we go on, as we talk about the other suspects and stuff. It seems that a lot of stuff was covered up or not paid attention to properly. You'll see. People said that Mark Hansen was obsessed with Elizabeth Short. He thought she was so beautiful. He wanted her, but she was hard to get. She didn't give herself over to men easily at all, especially after her fiancé that died in the war. She'd never really had like a proper boyfriend since that. And so Mark Hansen, whenever he would see her in the bars and in the clubs, he would move to her and she would reject him. time and time again. And people think that this could have been his motive. He desperately wanted her and she didn't want him. So if he couldn't have her, no one could. Or maybe it was just a very sensitive masculinity thing of like, that bitch rejected me, now she's got to pay, you know, like a revenge killing. But of course, Mark Hansen, being the very wealthy, respected, popular socialite that he wasn't going to get his own hands dirty. And so that's where the theory comes in that maybe he hired Leslie Dillon, who was actually a former mortuary assistant. So he'd worked with dead bodies in the past. He knew how to do, I think, like autopsies and stuff. Which is interesting because, remember, police believed that the Black Dahlia killer must have some sort of medical or anatomical education. Whoever it was knew how to drain a body of blood, knew how to make a seamless cut across the middle of her body. It wasn't messy, it wasn't hacked up, it was done very professionally. Leslie also seemed to know little pieces of information that weren't printed by the news. So going back to that thing I mentioned about the rose tattoo that hasn't really been confirmed, this is kind of how the rose tattoo plays into this case, is because people say Leslie Dillon knew that Elizabeth Shaw had a rose tattoo on her thigh and it had been cut off and shoved inside of her. And he told the police that, but that was never mentioned in the news. So that's supposedly some sort of evidence that he was the killer. But also, that being said, we don't know if the rose tattoo thing is even true. And when Pugh Eatwell was writing her book and coming up with her theory and everything, she came across an account from a motel owner in the area. They owned the Astor Motel. It was quite a small one, only had 10 cabins. It was quite a cheap one. The owner of this motel was called Henry Hoffman, and he said that on January 15th, 1947, the morning that Elizabeth Smart's body was found, Henry said that he opened the door to one of his motel cabins and he found the room covered in blood and fecal matter. In another cabin, he found a bundle of women's clothes wrapped in brown paper, and when he opened it, those clothes were also covered in blood. And this is where it gets mental. Instead of reporting any of this to the police, he has found a room covered in blood, clothes covered in blood. Instead of reporting it, he just cleaned it up. He just cleaned it up himself and got those motel rooms ready to use again. He said that the reason he did this, the reason he didn't contact police at the time, was because he had already been seen by the police a few days prior for domestic violence charges against his wife, and he just didn't want to deal with the police right now. He didn't want any more accusations against him, I guess, so he just didn't. He could have cleaned up the Black Dahlia murder scene and never once told the police. So that's what Pugh believes, that this is where Elizabeth Shaw was tortured, murdered, and probably mutilated, here, in that motel room. And there were a few eyewitness reports ever since this kind of came out. People that were staying in the motel at that time said that they saw a woman walking around the area that looked like Elizabeth Shaw. She was a very beautiful woman with curly jet black hair. Of course, we can't be sure if it was Elizabeth, but I think that's a very interesting theory. But now for the third suspect, and probably the most famous or infamous Black Dahlia murder suspect, a man named Dr. George Hodel. And the main reason we suspect George Hodel is because his own son also suspects him of being a murderer, not just to the Black Dahlia. His son suspects his father of being a serial killer. We'll talk more about the other murders a little bit later on. Right now, I just want to focus on George Hodel's connections to the Black Dahlia specifically. And I also want to give Steve a little bit of credibility in the beginning of this, because you might just think he's some crazy guy who is making up stuff about his father. But Steve was an LAPD homicide detective for 20 years. He'd never worked on the Black Dahlia case, of course, that was a bit before his time. But when he retired, that was when he ran into this theory, and he decided to dedicate his life to looking into the connections between his father and the Black Dahlia case. George died in 1999, and all of this began when Steve was round at his house, you know, sorting through and packing up his belongings to be able to clear out his house. And that was when he came across a photo album that was kind of tucked away in a little box in the back of a closet. And when he got this photo album out, it looked pretty normal. There were lots of pictures of the family and friends and of George. And then 2 photos of a beautiful, dark, jet black haired woman. He didn't recognize this woman in the pictures at first. I mean, he didn't recognize a lot of the people in the pictures because his dad was a socialite. He had parties at his house all the time. There were so many different faces in this photo album. But there was something about this curly, dark-haired woman that it struck him immediately as soon as he saw it. And the longer he looked at these photos, he then realized that this could be the Black Dahlia. Of course, the murder case had happened decades before this, so he had to do a little bit of research and a little bit of comparing, but Steve was confident that he had just found photos of Elizabeth Short in his father's personal photo albums. And it wasn't like Steve saw these photos and immediately his brain jumped to, okay, my dad must have killed her. Trust me, George Hurdell was not a nice man. He did a lot of terrible things in his life. And Steve seeing these pictures of a woman that looks like the Black Dahlia, and he thinks is the Black Dahlia, to him, it wasn't a far stretch to say that his father could have also been a murderer, on top of all the other horrible shit that he'd done. So let me tell you a little bit about George Hurdell, shall I? He was a very, very smart child. Insanely smart, to the point where he raced through school and managed to get into university at the age of 15. And this is where things get very fucked up very quickly. When he was 15 in university, one of his professor's wives took a liking to him and started grooming him and started a sexual relationship with him that she actually got pregnant through. She was now pregnant to a 15-year-old and had to come clean to her husband, who was a professor at the university, and everything just blew up, as I'm sure you can imagine. I'm not sure what happened to that child, whether it was born. I don't think so. I mean, considering I couldn't find it, I don't think it was born. But from that point, George was kicked out of the university. I think he ended up finishing all his medical degrees and stuff at a different one. And after school, George became a ladies' man. He had a lot of different wives throughout his life and a lot of different children to these different wives. He had so many kids that he probably couldn't even keep track. Like I said, he finished all of his medical degrees and he decided to special in venereal diseases and secret abortions. He was a gynecologist, and normally you would like to think that people don't choose their job for weird ulterior motives, but George Hurdell definitely did. Definitely. His son believes he was a sex addict, a sexual deviant, and as you get to know more about this man, it really doesn't surprise me that he chose to spend his everyday around vaginas. He didn't even treat women as humans, so get ready for that. This also meant that George Hurdell's main client base were young women who had found themselves in difficult positions, whether they have an STI or have a pregnancy that they don't want. He was getting a lot of vulnerable women through his door every day, and I think that has something to do with why he chose to specialise in such an area. George was a very, very popular and respected doctor. He ended up becoming doctor to the stars. Of course, living in LA and having such a great reputation meant that he could charge so much freaking money, but also, as we will come to a little bit later, it's believed that he did some dodgy business in terms of tax and overcharging patients and telling them that they needed XYZ medication just so that he could get the money out of them when they didn't actually need it. Whatever way he managed to get all this money, regardless, he had a fucking lot of it. And again, that made him even more popular in the LA circles. He would always be schmoozing around other rich people and celebrities and throwing parties at his house. He actually ended up buying this great big mansion in LA called Soden House, and this is an insane building. It was made to look kind of like a Mayan temple. Very, very impressive. A lot of work went into that house, and he loved it. It was his pride and joy. He would always be hosting parties there. And this house is said to have been a hub for debauchery, crime. He would bring back tons of different women just for him and his friends to sleep with. He was a seedy guy with a lot of seedy friends and a lot of money. So you can probably imagine the kind of shit that was going down at those parties when everyone else was turning a blind eye. A photographer who was in those kind of LA circles at the time has since been quoted talking about Hurdell's house, saying women were tortured for sport there. Murders happened there. Murders happened there, and he didn't elaborate on that. And now I'm going to find it very hard to just move on, because what do you mean someone literally said the words, murders happened there, and that's all we get? Like, there's no... Okay, but that was someone that regularly went to these parties, and he was also a photographer, so that probably means he had a bit of like a client base, a bit of a semi-following, you know? So for him, he can't just throw these things around willy-nilly and without evidence? Surely. Anyway, moving on. Remember I said George had so many kids. So many kids. But he often just left them with the mums. Whenever he would break up with his wives or his girlfriends or whatever, the kids would stay with them. But because he had such a big house and so many kids, there did come times where their mums would send them to live with him. And none of them had a good time at their dad's house. One of his daughters, named Tamar, has come out and spoke about how traumatizing her time was in George Hurdell's house. She was pressured to sunbathe naked, and Hurdell would invite all his friends round and they would sit in the garden and just watch her, and his photography friends would like take pictures of her naked, and she's a teenager. Well, she's not even a teenager at this point. She was with him when she was about 10 or 11 years old. A 10-year-old. About this photographer that would take pictures of her naked, she said, "I knew he was a great artist, but I didn't feel comfortable. He felt like a dirty old man." She also said that her father would give her erotic books to read so that he could make her a sex goddess, which is gross. She is 10 years old. When Tamar was 11 years old, her father began regularly raping her. And he would justify his actions saying that the pharaohs had sex with their daughters. When Tamar was 16 years old, she gave birth to a little baby girl. At this point, she was away from George Hurdell and his house, although it's still not known to this day if that baby was his or not, and it is believed to have probably been his child. Her name was Fauna Hurdell. However, when Tamar gave her up for adoption, she was given to a new family and she was given a completely different name. She grew up not knowing who her parents were, not knowing what her background was, not knowing anything that led to her birth. And so when she was older and she started to discover all of this, I just cannot imagine reading into my past, hoping to find out who my biological parents were and maybe reconnect. But imagine coming across the fact that you are more than likely a product of incest, a product of your mother being raped repeatedly at 15 years old. That is just so heartbreaking. Fauna has since passed away, but she believed that she probably was Tamar and George's child, and a lot of other people do too. It's genuinely some of the most devastating shit I have ever heard. Tamar's story is so sad. Like, there were parts of her time with her father where she was even like a little bit brainwashed. I think it was a mixture of being a bit brainwashed because her father was so persuasive, saying that, you know, the pharaohs had sex with their children, and he'd been doing it since she was so young that it was semi-normal to her. But then there was also the fact that she was scared of him. She was scared of what he could do to her, what he was capable of, and so she just kind of stayed in that situation. She didn't try to escape or to tell anyone and get help. Tamar's mother urged her to try to get away from her father when she realised that all of this was happening. She was telling her to just run away and go hide with someone, with a friend, or just go sleep out on the street, just do anything to get away from your dad. But when she was met with some resistance from Tamar, she ended up telling her that she believes her father is a murderer, and she's worried that he could murder Tamar too if she didn't run away. And this wasn't a baseless claim from Tamar's mother, because George Hurdell did have a secretary that died not long after the Black Dahlia case. The secretary's cause of death was a suicide, but no one really believes that. She wasn't depressed, she wasn't showing signs of wanting to end her life. It was all so sudden. And of course, because she was his secretary, there's a potential motive there. Maybe she knew something about what George Hurdell had been getting up to, and maybe she was gonna tell, or maybe she was trying to blackmail him. But whatever it was, it seemed that George maybe wanted her gone. So Tamar's mother told her this, and she was like, look, you need to run away because I think your dad has killed someone before. He could do it to you. As soon as she hears that, she's like, okay, yeah, I'm out. She ran away and hid out at a friend's house for a couple of days, but because she was a minor, she was about 14, 15 when she ran away, the police found her and tried to take her back to her father. When she told them that she didn't want to go back and she started to explain herself, one of them turned to her and said, "We know all about your father," which is so eerie. What do they mean by that? What? Like, they know all about what he's been doing, but they turn a blind eye? They've been paid off by him? Maybe he spoke to them before they went and found her, and I don't know, that's just very scary to me. We know all about your father, yet they're still there to take her back to him, knowing what he's like. Tamar did report him for rape, for incest, for sexually assaulting her, all of the above, and she even had 3 eyewitnesses as well, people that were in the room as George Hodel forced himself on his daughter, but even with that, the case fell apart. At the end of the trial, George was acquitted of the charges, although it was later found that witnesses and members of the jury might have been given payoffs of upwards of $15,000 to either change their story or to sway the case in George's favour. His lawyer also constructed a horrific smear campaign against Tamar. He said that she was a pathological liar, she was promiscuous, she was a slut, she was just trying to get money from her father, all these kind of things, none of which were true. I mean, she literally had 3 eyewitnesses on her side saying, "I saw him force himself on her." But that wasn't enough, and for some reason, George won the case. So he got off completely scot-free. Meanwhile, Tamar was transferred to a juvenile detention centre for being a victim. So that is Dr. George Hodel, our 3rd Black Dahlia suspect. And I'm sorry that his backstory was so long, but oh my god, how could I not include all of that? I think it's just very important to show this man's character, and this is exactly why when Steve came across those photos of a woman that looked like the Black Dahlia, he thought, oh yeah, my shitbag dad could have probably been a murderer on top of a rapist and everything else that he was that we don't know because he paid the police off, but I'm sure he was a criminal in a lot of ways. There were just a lot of things that connected about George Hodel and Elizabeth Short. He was a doctor, he was a surgeon, he had a lot of knowledge of anatomy, and of course they think that it must have been a doctor or someone with a medical degree. He had both. He specialised in vulnerable, desperate female patients that either had an unwanted pregnancy or an unwanted infection. It's very possible that Elizabeth could have gone to him one day with a problem that she thought that he could solve, and instead he murdered her. So Steve went digging through all of his father's belongings, everything that his dad had left behind, to see if he could find any supporting evidence for his theory, and this was when he came across some receipts. His father had bought a few big heavy bags of concrete just before Elizabeth Short's murder, and this doesn't seem suspicious on its own, but when compared with the crime scene photos of Elizabeth's body, there is a giant bag of concrete right by her. And again, that probably doesn't sound too suspicious, but remember, her body was found just in the grass. It wasn't like it was an active construction site where concrete was even being used. So it's just strange that he would buy giant bags of concrete and then a week later there's a giant bag of concrete, the exact same brand, found right by the murder victim that he is accused of murdering. Like, it could be a coincidence, but it also could be evidence. It's a tricky one. Steve also hired a handwriting expert to compare his father's handwriting with that second handwritten note that we think is from the Black Dahlia killer, but we're not entirely sure. But either way, he hired a handwriting expert to come in, and he said that it was a likely match. Now, likely is not conclusive, it's not an exact match, so still no solid evidence, and you also have to bear in mind that this is a handwriting expert that he has paid to support his own theory. There might be some level of confirmation bias. But Steve wasn't just stopping there. He was trying to find evidence all over the place. He filed a Freedom of Information request to the FBI so that he could get all the files and all the documents on the Black Dahlia murder, and he realised that his father, back in the day, was considered one of the top 6 suspects for this case. Police believed this so much so that they actually audio-bugged George Hodell's home so that they could listen into the conversations that he was having and see if he implicated himself. And so now Steve is looking through these transcripts of all the recorded audio bits, and there are some very interesting quotes. So a few weeks after the Black Dahlia murder, they're all just in the house, and the audio equipment picks up a woman screaming, and then silence, and then the woman screams again. Later that day, there was something mentioned between George and a friend about leaving no trace. Later that same day, George says, I think to the same friend, realised there was nothing I could do. Put a pillow over her head and cover her with a blanket. Get a taxi. Expired at 12:59. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they might have figured it out. Killed her. Literally ended with killed her. And it's believed that this part of the transcript is not in relation to the Black Dahlia murder. They think they might have caught him murdering his secretary on this audio recording equipment. Because it's true, his secretary died of a suicide not long after the Black Dahlia murder. So it's no wonder that they've been connected, especially when there's things like this. What are you talking about? Expired at 12:59. Cover her with a blanket. Put a pillow over her head. We later on find out that George Hodell was present when his secretary took her own life, supposedly. His believed motive for wanting to kill his secretary, if it was him, was that maybe she knew about his seedy business practices and all his issues with tax and overcharging patients and stuff, and maybe she was going to do something about it, and maybe he didn't want her to. Or maybe his secretary knew something about the Black Dahlia, because if Dr. George Hodell had killed Elizabeth Short, say she was one of his patients, and he killed her as he was performing surgery on her, then his secretary's gonna know that. She's the one that books in the patients, and, you know, all of a sudden one of them turns up murdered, and your boss is George Hodell? I would also kind of be thinking that my boss is looking suspicious right now, and maybe she mentioned something to him, and maybe he didn't want her to know that much. Later on, George was also recorded on these bugs saying, supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead. There we go. There we fucking go. George Hodell passed away in 1999. He was never charged officially with any murders. Although Steve is very eager for the FBI or for the police to reopen the Black Dahlia case and specifically look into his father as the killer. He believes it with all of his heart and soul. He has dug so far into the Black Dahlia case and into George Hodell's life, so much so that he's actually managed to find supporting evidence, kind of. Remember I said he thought his dad could potentially be a serial killer, that the Black Dahlia wasn't his only murder? Because after a while, his dad fled LA and went to go live in the Philippines. And shortly after his arrival, another woman turned up dead, cut in two, almost exactly like the Black Dahlia. She was cut across the middle. And she also looked like Elizabeth Short, young, dark hair, beautiful. Seems like he has a victim type, if this is true. The two cases have never been officially connected. I don't know if that's even been looked into. But he believes there's even more than just those two. It seems that these very gruesome, brutal murders followed his father no matter what country he was in. Some people doubt Steve Hodell and this whole theory, and even Steve's intentions with putting this theory out there. A lot of people think maybe he's just clutching at straws and trying to stretch evidence and theories to be able to make a book and to make money on it, which I don't know. Because, well, I mean, Steve Hodell later went on to theorize that his dad could also be the Zodiac killer. So, I don't know. I think if he hadn't have done that, I would have believed it so much more. But now I feel like we are clutching at straws. Like, the Zodiac killer was 10 years later. I don't know, maybe. But the Zodiac killer shot his victims, didn't he? Like, it's totally different. I don't know. Pick a theory, one or the other. Not gonna lie though, up until that point, he kind of had me on this one. The Dr. George Hodell theory is quite promising. I'm looking forward to reading the comments on this video because I really want to know what you guys think, what your theories are, which suspects you think are the most likely. Yeah, George Hodell is still my front runner, but I'm not 100% sold on the theory. And like I said before, there are a few theories relating to serial killers. A lot of people think that Elizabeth Short could have been an unidentified victim of a serial killer that we know of. The Cleveland torso murderer killed 13 people, although 13 confirmed, although it's believed that the victim count was over 20. So even there are believed to be victims out there that we haven't connected to this case yet, so maybe Elizabeth could be one. This is a theory due to the way that the victims of this killer were found. They were all chopped up and mutilated. It was a very, very grisly case. And Elizabeth was also found mutilated and chopped up. But that is kind of the only thing that really connects the two. Elizabeth was murdered in LA and the Cleveland torso murders took place in Cleveland, would you guess it? And it was also like 10 years prior to the Black Dahlia. So I guess it makes sense that someone could have been killing in Cleveland and then moved to LA and then done this one, but I don't know. In my opinion, that one's a bit of a stretch. One that I think does have some ground to it is the series of lone woman murders, which some people believe could be the work of one serial killer, had killed all these women, or a couple of killers. But either way, these are a bunch of women that were found murdered, often mutilated, sometimes sexually mutilated, and their killers have never been identified. So connections between Elizabeth and the lone woman murders, they all looked very similar. Young, conventionally attractive, very feminine. There's over 10 cases that have been grouped together in these lone woman murders. And like I say, we don't know if it was the work of a serial killer or if they were all different one-off cases. But if it was the work of a serial killer, then I think this could be a pretty good theory that the Black Dahlia was another one of his victims and potentially his most infamous of all. But to this day, the Black Dahlia case remains unsolved. Oh, felt like BuzzFeed Unsolved then, but seriously, to this day, it's still not solved. Those are the top suspects, and I really don't think it ever will be solved because it's been nearly 100 years. Everyone that was involved in this case is now dead. All the suspects are dead. All the police that worked on the case are dead. All we have is vague evidence. We don't even have like a lot of the physical evidence anymore because it's been about 75 years and a lot of things have gone missing or were contaminated at the time. This is one thing that is very annoying about very early murder cases when we weren't very forensically aware, is that I bet even if we did have that physical evidence, it would be so useless because the amount of people that will have handled it and, you know, it wouldn't have been stored properly. Oh, I hate to imagine. So I fear that at this point, the Black Dahlia case will never be solved. At this point, it goes beyond the justice system. So I guess all that's left for us to do now is to make up our own minds on who we think could have murdered Elizabeth Short, who we think could have gotten away with one of the most infamous murders in history. And like I said, I'm looking forward to reading the comments on this video because even I am still very undecided. Like I say, I think George Hodel is my closest theory, but even then, I'm not fully convinced. I don't know. I'm excited to read you guys' comments. Thanks again to Casetify for sponsoring this video. Remember, if you go to casetify.com/Eleanor, you can get 15% off of your order, and that will be automatically applied for you at checkout. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up down below. I would really appreciate it. If you want to watch another one of my videos, there'll be one on screen right now, or if you click the little circle with my face in, you can subscribe to my channel because we post new true crime content every single week. So with that being said, I will see you next week. Bye!